Those who would argue that the 60s marked the end of the good old days, the end of family stability, the end of everything being predictable and comfortable. And that was when divorce went up, and that's when people started to question family life and all of those kinds of things. And that's when sexuality ran amok. I mean, there are certain ways you can look at those indicators, but on the most basic level, what I think is important to understand is that the children of the 60s, baby boom children growing up, in some ways behaved a whole lot more like their grandparents than they behaved like their parents. So if we take the long view, what do we see happening in their grandparents' lives? Well, the grandparents grew up in the early decades of the 20th century. What happened then? Massive consumer revolution, a massive sexual revolution. The incidence, if we just want to look at premarital sexual intercourse, which is a very bad indicator of sexual activity, but the one that everyone is obsessed with. So if we want to just look at that, there have really been only 2 times in the last century that particular sexual behavior increased dramatically. One time was in the early 20th century, and the second time was in the 60s. So you have the children then, the grandchildren, behaving in a lot of ways like their grandparents. The divorce rate went up in both eras. Both eras were marked by an explosion of popular culture, new forms of public amusements, especially a powerful youth culture. So somehow the generation in between is what is really strange, and somehow in our popular consciousness we have dubbed them the normal, the traditional. There was nothing traditional about them. They were very bizarre and unusual by historical standards. So one way to look at the 60s is to say, well, the children of the 60s just went right back to the way their grandparents were and picked up and went ahead from there. So on some level, what happened in the 60s wasn't so dramatic. What were the pieces that were new? Well, if we want to look at degree, we could say, well, the divorce rate had increased dramatically in the early 20th century, leveled off in the 50s. In fact, it even went down. That was a very, very striking thing to happen. This sense of family solidarity was so powerful that the divorce rate, which had been going up forever, I mean, there was no, with the exception of the 30s for economic reasons, the divorce rate had really steadily increased. It suddenly flattens a little. Certainly, as far as I'm concerned, it had nothing to do with people being more happily married. It wasn't about that. But it was about some kind of a commitment to that stable family unit. So what happens in the late 60s, of course, is a skyrocketing of the divorce rate that was unprecedented. Another thing that happens is a change in people's sexual behavior outside of marriage. An increase that was marked, and an increase in accepting attitudes about sexual behavior. But what's curious is that the opinion polls at the time show that people's behavior was changing faster than their attitudes, so that you would have college students, even in the early 70s, asked whether they had engaged in premarital sex. Again, a misnomer because it assumes it was premarital. Who was to say whether it was premarital or just sex outside of marriage? So all of these terms, I think, are very loaded. But anyway, if they were asked whether they had done it, the vast majority said they had. If they were asked whether they approved of it, the vast majority of the very same group said they disapproved. So I guess the psychologists would call it cognitive dissonance. I would call it guilt.